Hi there, I'm Johannes Keating. There are patients that are not likely to make therapeutic progress until they can experience that their relationship with the therapist is not contingent on them making progress. And these kinds of patients, usually they've had very conditional relationships fraught with a ton of abandonment. They have a hard time imagining a scenario where if the therapist is frustrated or disappointed, if they don't please the therapist and the therapist's ambitions to feel like they're doing a good job, that they won't be devalued or thought of as less than or punished in some form or fashion. Which, if you think about it, it's not entirely unreasonable. It's not like therapists are immune from acting out in one form or another or becoming less enthusiastic if the patient is not progressing. So, to my thinking, it's a mistake to frame these patient concerns, human concerns, as purely defensive. Sure, we can see projection of will, we can see projection of superego in these kinds of circumstances a lot of the times, but there's also the reality that the patient's life experience often has included a whole lot of experiences where unless they placate, unless they please the other, the relationship truly is in jeopardy. And so I often say to these kinds of patients and to my trainees who work with these kinds of patients, something to the effect of that this is a real dilemma. I can see why you would not want to open up to me if in your mind I'm someone who's going to think less of you or devalue you or be less invested in working with you, right, unless you make me happy, unless you please me. It's a real dilemma, and so the million-dollar question is whether or not I really am that sort of a person. Either I am, and it makes sense that you're keeping your guard up, or I'm not. And you might be missing out on an opportunity here for more healing and progress. But until we get clear and make a determination as to what sort of person I am here, it makes perfect sense that you're reticent about opening up. And really, not until that corner has been turned are these kinds of patients going to really make some real headway and have deeper forms of psychological healing. You know, you could make the argument that, well, ultimately, why does it matter, right? Isn't the goal simply to help the patient reach their goals? And this major concern about the therapeutic relationship, whether or not the therapist is going to think less of the patient and so on, it's a red herring. It's a defensive red herring because, after all, really it's about helping the patient go from A to B. And of course, there's truth that ultimately what it's all about is to help the patient reach their goals. The issue is that the vehicle or the instrument through which we help the patient reach their goals is the therapeutic relationship. It's the patient and the therapist together examining the patient's most intimate thoughts and most intimate feelings. And for that to happen, the patient has to experience the patient has to experience the therapist as someone they would want to be that intimate with. And so if they're seeing the therapist as potentially punitive or disinterested, unless they please the therapist, they're not going to want to open up. They're not going to want to. So there's a number of considerations. First of all, the therapist ought to examine themselves and see whether or not there could be some truth to the patient's concerns. Like, some of it could be reality-based. You know, there are probably therapists who, when their ambitions are frustrated, they really do lose interest. I mean, I remember hearing about Davinlu. Actually, no, I heard him when I saw him in 2012 or 13. He would say things like, well, unless you let go of this wall, this is a waste of my time, which actually sounds rather punitive and shaming. Like, it's never a waste of our time. We're getting paid, right? So it's a shaming thing to say. It's a waste of my time. It might very well be a waste of the patient's time, sure, and their money. and their resources, but never ours. We're getting paid. So how could it be a waste of our time? Plus, this is what we do, right? We work with defenses. That's the bread and butter of what we do. And so these are the kinds of things to think through. The other reason why I think it's a mistake to frame these concerns as purely defensive is that there seems to be some truth to the idea that human flourishing requires that the individual has a home in another person's heart. Like failure to thrive, the child has all of their physical needs attended to, but because there isn't another human being who is concerned and caring and nurturing and tuned in emotionally to that child, there's a failure to thrive. And so I don't think it's entirely unfounded to be concerned about whether or not we really have a place in the heart of the other person who we are considering opening up to. I don't think they're entirely unfounded concerns. And so, and additionally, I think we all know that there are courses of treatments where the standardized ISTDP and standard mobilization, it just doesn't work, or it backfires. I remember hearing about people that saw Davanu for therapy. They essentially contrived and had compliant unlockings. Davanu would say things like, unless you're going to take down this wall, you might as well fly back to Paris, or whatever it was. And so, in duress, for fear of punitive consequences, they had unlockings, obviously pseudo-unlockings. And then obviously part of the symptom picture was intact. So, I think most of us have experienced that ourselves in our own practices. I have it on good authority that these kinds of things happen with people that saw Davanu for treatment. So, to me, that's also evidence that refutes the idea that we're putting too much stock on the therapeutic relationship and the person of the therapist, and that ultimately what matters is that the therapist has the procedural know-how to help the patient get from point A to point B. I don't think it's that procedural or mechanic. We're talking about the human soul. We're talking about the idea of allowing another person into our most intimate thoughts and our most intimate feelings. And given that reality, the concerns as to whether or not the therapist will think less of us or have a place in their hearts for us if we don't please them is often valid, particularly for patients who had a lot of relational history where those relationships were conditional and there were punitive, negative relational consequences for not pleasing the other person. And so, to my mind, this is a bit of an Achilles heel when it comes to ISTDP. I think the metapsychology, the central dynamic sequence, it's largely very solid and worthy of really putting stock in. But I think the pressure and the challenge and the intense mobilization, when it comes to these types of patients, with very egocentric compliance. And sure, again, right, it isn't like there's no defensive process going on at all in terms of projection of will and superego. But I think that pressure and challenge can backfire, and that we first have to help these kinds of patients turn this corner where they can actually experience, not just hear the words, but deeply experience that the therapist has positive, unconditional, positive regard for them, regardless of whether or not they're pleasing the therapist and pleasing the therapist's ambitions to feel like they're doing a good job and that they're good psychotherapists. Now, if you manage to facilitate this kind of corrective emotional experience, where the patient really learns to experience you, the therapist, as not fitting this description, as really being there in an unwavering, solid manner in terms of commitment and interest, regardless of how they perform. If you manage to facilitate that kind of an experience, which is obviously a very corrective emotional experience, and the patient still has lingering concerns that they dwell on about, are you happy with me, or are you displeased with me, and so on and so forth. Well, now we're looking at a different animal. So that would be consistent with more of a standard superego pathology and a more of a purely defensive process, be that projection of will or projection of superego or some form of making the other the main focus. So I believe that takes us to the end of my spiel for this evening. I thank you for watching. Until next time.